Hey there folks, Wrel here. Today we're going to be talking about the burst variants of the default carbine and assault rifles available for each faction. The naming conventions for some of these weapons are a little bit messed up, but for the Terran Republic, that's the Track 5S and the T1B Cycler. For the new conglomerate, it's the Gauss Compact Burst and the Gauss Rifle Burst. And for the Vanu Sovereignty, it's the Solstice Burst and the Equinox Burst. Burst variants didn't have a whole lot of value as actual burst weapons for a long time due to heavy recoil and few positive trade-offs, but the weapons have recently received some noteworthy changes, making them worth a second look. That said, this isn't going to be a full review of each weapon, but we're going to instead break down some of the changes and why they're significant, and also offer some advice on how to use them effectively, what attachments to equip, and whether or not they'll fit your personal playstyle. All burst variants now cost 650 certifications or 499 daybreak cash to unlock. What they've received over their automatic counterparts are access to high velocity ammo, a smaller aim down sights cone of fire, less vertical recoil all around, which includes their first shot recoil multiplier, as well as slightly lower horizontal recoil. One note about the TR carbine and assault rifle is that they'll also carry 42 rounds instead of the automatic's 40 because they're firing in a 3-shot burst. To offset those buffs though, they've also had their hip fire cone of fire increased. There were also some additional tweaks to minimum and maximum magnitude values, which I think have something to do with vertical recoil, but I'm not entirely sure how it works. For the TR and the VS, both carbines and assault rifles are 3-round bursts, whereas the NC's weapons are 2-shot bursts. This is based on their damage models being 143 versus 167, and additionally, you can also click them over to single-shot fire modes if you really want to. It's also worth noting that these buffs do not apply to weapons that have burst fire, that have single fire modes. The changes you see here are specific adjustments to baseline stats of the 6 weapons that we're talking about. So stats-wise, your burst variants are far and away better than their automatic counterparts while you aim down sights, but they do take a substantial hit in the hip fire department. This is a good trade-off because the automatic versions of each weapon are actually pretty formidable as hipfire weapons once you have a laser sight equipped. But for the burst variants, laser sights are more like putting a small band-aid on a big cut. In my opinion, the better option is to just kind of min-max and go right for the forward grip. What's also kind of interesting is that these burst weapon variants can be timed to fire at or very close to the maximum rate of fire as their automatic counterparts. So essentially, if you have the right trigger discipline, the weapon basically acts as if it were automatic in terms of rate of fire. Now, achieving that maximum rate of fire takes some practice, but it's pretty simple in theory. When you fire off a burst, and while that volley is still firing, you want to then click and hold until the next burst fires, and then you click and hold again. So basically what maximum rate of fire looks like is click to fire, then click and hold, click and hold, click and hold. So from this outlook, you may see the variants and think to yourself, hey, cool, I am an aim down sights player, so this seems like a straight upgrade to me. And in theory, statistically, it definitely may be. And through practice, it absolutely can be. But generally speaking, burst weapons are more difficult to use than their automatic counterparts. That's because tracking a target while clicking multiple times is harder to do than just holding down the mouse and tracking your target. It's basically the video game equivalent of patting your head and rubbing your tummy at the same time, except the learning curve for that is probably a bit easier than dealing with burst weapons. My recommendation to newer players would just be to stick with your automatic weapons, learn how to track targets well, then when you're really good at it, you start learning how to track your target's head well. And then when you're really good at that, you should find it easier to make a transition to burst weapons, as the process of tracking and putting out headshots requires you to burst anyway. A little quirk that I'm not so fond of with burst weapons is that if you press your reload key mid-burst, the weapon won't start reloading when the burst is over. So coming from an automatic weapon where you fire, you let off the trigger, you press R or square, and then the thing instantly starts reloading, you'll probably notice yourself having to hit the reload key multiple times if you're trying to be quick. Another quirk that relates more to gameplay than anything else is that each weapon either operates in a 2-round burst or a 3-round burst, and because of that, you've got a pretty high chance of wasting some ammo on a dead target. Honestly, this happens a lot with automatics anyway, just due to user error, but imagine your assault rifles, which are 143 damage out to 10 meters, and then tapering off to 125. That's a 7 to 8 shot kill. While if you're firing a 3-round burst and you're actually landing all shots on the chest, that's 3 bursts, so 9 shots, you're either wasting 1 or 2 rounds. And if you accidentally click again on the dead target, that's another 3. The NC version has a 2-round burst, so at most you'll only ever waste 1 round from a shots to kill perspective, but it is something to think about. Not super important, but just kind of quirky. When using a burst variant, I'd recommend high velocity ammo on each of the carbines, as that's going to help your mid-range kill potential, but I wouldn't equip it on assault rifles, because it doesn't do a whole lot of good for weapons with 2 tiers of damage fall off, unless they really could use the additional projectile velocity, which these weapons really don't. I would throw a forward grip on the Wrel instead of a laser sight, as we talked about earlier. Then I would equip a 2x reflex as an optic, or you could go up or down based on preference, but a 2x does feel pretty good given the weapon's effective range, and the screen shake isn't as punishing as using a 3.4x or higher if you aren't running battle hardened. Both suppressors and flash suppressors are completely legit depending on your engagement range, but it does shorten up that range a fair amount. The suppressor's damage drop off and the lower bullet velocity does reel in the weapon's effectiveness a great deal, but it is still reasonable for sneaky light assaults. The flash suppressors cause a little bit of inaccuracy due to the slightly expanding cone of fire bloom, but I do want to stress the word slightly, because it has very little effect unless you're actually spamming the trigger. And speaking of which, I personally tend to do better with these weapons when I'm not spamming the trigger, and instead I'm taking a moment to line up a proper volley. The only times you really want to rail on the trigger is when you feel like a target's going to get away from you and it's a last-ditch effort to land a bullet on them, or if you're trying to fight at closer ranges where you need to maximize your rate of fire. Lining up a volley is done in 2 different ways depending on which weapon you're using and how good you are at compensating for the recoil. The first and most reliable is to just aim for the chest or the upper chest and let the second or third shots kick into the head area. The alternative is to start at the head and then compensate for the recoil. For most of these weapons, you need to drag straight down, so just before and during a burst, and then you'll be able to compensate for the recoil, no problem. But for the Track 5 burst, the Solstice burst, and the Equinox burst, you'll need to drag down and to the left to compensate, and this could be much more troublesome. That said, the reasons that you'd ever want to run one of these burst weapons mainly comes down to control. If you're a player who has their trigger discipline down, you know how to land headshots, and you don't usually fire from the hip, then taking a Track 5 burst over a Track 5 is basically an upgrade to you. There may be other options that are more specific to the role that you're currently playing in. For example, you wouldn't want to take a burst weapon over a Jaguar in CQC, ideally, but you definitely could. The burst variants, if nothing else, offer a unique challenge to the player while actually giving you a worthwhile payoff in the process, and the certification cost is middle of the road. The playstyle may not be for everyone, but the weapons themselves are definitely worth a look now if you've had an interest. If this video has been interesting, helpful, or entertaining, please feel free to like, subscribe, tell your friends about the channel, and if you'd like to share some thoughts on the new burst weapon variants or burst weapons in general, then go ahead, do that in the comment section down below. Thanks very much, folks. Wrel signing off.